Hello and welcome to Wilson Center Now, a production of the Woodrow Wilson International Center for Scholars. I'm John Molesky. My guest today is Blair Ruble. Blair is a distinguished fellow with the Wilson Center who previously served in a number of capacities, including Vice President for Programs, Director of the Kennan Institute, and also of the Urban Sustainability Laboratory. Blair's also a prolific author, and his latest book is titled Portraying the Soul of a People, African Americans Confront Wilson's Legacy from the Washington Stage. Blair, congratulations on the book and welcome to Wilson Center Now.
Well, thank you, John. It's always good to be here with you.
So before we dive into the book, for those of our viewers who know you as a Russia expert or as an urbanist, tell us about your interest in the arts.
Well, I long ago came to believe that the arts were a window on how a society comes to terms with itself. And I found the arts to be a very good entry point into trying to understand the Soviet Union and subsequently Russia and Ukraine. And I took those lessons that I gained as a Russianist and began to apply them here in Washington and in the American context. And I found it a very useful way of seeing how people actually discuss and work through some of the most difficult issues of their own lives in society.
In that regard, do you think that we underestimate the influence and the role that the arts play?
Oh, I don't think there's any doubt about it. The other part of this is when you take a look at what lasts in a society, it's not the politics, it's the arts, science as well, obviously. But when we think about what were the Italian Renaissance about, we think about the art. And what were the high points of Russia in the 20th century? There are plenty of low points, but the high points often revolved around the arts and expression. And I think we tend to underestimate the dynamism and power and importance of all the arts. As you know, I've written probably more about music than about theater, particularly with a focus in Washington. I think people who want to come to terms with how societies change can find an interesting window by approaching society through the arts.
And this particular book, tell us the backstory of how you came to write it.
Well, as you know, John, the viewers, I'll mention this. I wrote a book about a decade ago on the history of U Street, which was the main street of African-American Washington a century ago. And during that time, I didn't really write about theater, but I kept encountering a number of figures who helped create African-American theater in the 20th century. And they were really interesting people. The U Street story is fundamentally a story about great people. So I started going back and I went to the Howard Archives and the Moreland Spring Garden Research Center, and I began going through the papers of some of the people involved. And it's just tremendously rich, full of information. So I began thinking about how to write about the role of theater in providing an expression in Washington, D.C., which after all, a century ago was a city where there was no electoral politics. And so I've been working on that project. And as we began to reevaluate the place of Woodrow Wilson on the question of race, I realized that a number of the people I was examining and looking at and going through their papers were very motivated in a antithetical way to Wilson. So that's how this particular slice of the pie came about. How is it that a number of prominent African Americans in Washington, D.C. tried to respond to Wilson through theater when they had no access to the vote, which is what this book is about.
So the in setting the scene of the time so people can understand what it was like, one of the things you write in the book is, one of the lines is, the heightened racism of the Wilson era and to the Southern white barbarism underlying an accelerating rate of lynching. These were really not anything like what we're used to now. These were really tough times.
These were very tough times. And indeed, the Wilson administration was responsible for half the regulations which limited life chances of African Americans in Washington. And Wilson was the first Southern president, and he came to town and to power with the beliefs that he grew up with in the South. And when I was telling the U Street story, I would talk about Jim Crow in Washington, and it never really seemed to connect with a number of people who hadn't lived through Jim Crow era. But there was one story that I found communicated just a little bit about what we're talking about. It was illegal to bury, for an African American to bury a family pet in a pet cemetery that was reserved for the pets of white people. That's the depth to which segregation went. It wasn't just about limiting certain jobs. It was really about denying full citizenship and full humanity to people. And that's actually, it's that denial that drove the people I'm writing about now in response.
You mentioned the books, the previous book about U Street and this book are really the stories of great people. One happens to involve theater. I have to say, reading the book, I was a bit intimidated in anticipating the interview of how we could begin to do justice to the cast of characters. And we can't in the time we have, so people need to read the book. But I want to bring up one name, and then we'll see who else you'd like to talk about, which is Thomas Montgomery Gregory. It seems to me that he had a consistent and persistent vision about the establishment of a national Black theater. Can you talk about him and his role?
Well, he's one of the heroes of my book, and I became very drawn to him, and I have had the very fortunate experience of actually getting to know a little bit his daughter. And Gregory is just a remarkable person. His father was one of the first graduates of Howard University, and his mother was had connections to Madagascar and also studied at Howard. And Gregory spent his first years as a child actually living on the Howard campus. And then his father moved to New Jersey to head up a school there. Gregory went to Harvard. He was in the famous Harvard class of 1910, one of the very few African Americans at Harvard at the time. And he came back to Howard to teach English. Then World War I came about. He was one of the leaders and instigators in the effort to get the Army to create an African American officer corps. And then after the war, he came back to Howard to head up the English department. And he was really drawn to the theater. So much so that throughout his life, he collected every playbill, every show he ever went to. And he had an interesting habit of identifying people of color who were somehow associated with the production or listed in the program. And Howard Archives has these materials. There are hundreds of playbills. So he was a real fanatic about theater. But for him, he saw theater as a means of creating the opportunity for African Americans to present their own stories without the mediation of others. And he became fascinated by the example of the Irish National Theatre, which had been founded in Dublin a decade and a half previously, precisely because it was about giving Irish voice to storytelling. And that's what he wanted to do at Howard. And he started out to take a collection of student theater clubs and build them into a powerful national company, which would be the National Negro Theater. Without giving too much of the story away, he has initial success, but then he runs afoul of university administration, and he's gone from Howard by the 20s. But his efforts, while they didn't create the National Negro Theater, it established a really dynamic drama program.
And that was a white administration, right? People need to understand it. Howard University at that time was administered
well, it wasn't only a white administration, but the white president at the time, who happened to be the last white president, Howard, actually looked down on African Americans and didn't really think they were fully capable of intellectual life. So this is the president of the university.
One of Gregory's criticisms of this notion of that African American elites, cultural elites, would attempt to unrace themselves was the term. Explain that. What does that mean?
Well, he was very concerned. I mean, at the time, serious drama in American theater was Shakespeare and derivatives of European theatrical forms. And he himself adored Shakespeare and played Shakespeare, but he became very concerned that the African American elites were so drawn to European models of what it meant to be American as a way of trying to and somehow gain acceptance, that they would turn their backs on actually the story, on African American stories. So he was a great advocate of this notion that folk drama portraying everyday African American life was really the way forward to create a vibrant theater.
You know, I was drawn to Gregory for a number of reasons, not the least of which, as you mentioned, his collecting of playbills. As a bit of a compulsive collector myself, I associated with that. Who else in the story would you like to mention? As you said, we don't want to give away the entire book, but who are some of the other key players?
Well,
that you
of course,
think are...
the other major figure in the story is Elaine Leroy Locke, who was the first African-American Rhodes Scholar, went to Harvard. He taught at Howard for a long time. He also was let go from Howard University in the mid-20s, and he moved to Harlem and became both the epitome and the leader of the New Negro movement. But he eventually came back to Howard and always retained interest in the drama program at Howard. And he's one of the most important American intellectuals of the 20th century. You know, it's funny. I found myself trying to communicate to people why these are interesting folks. And I realized that running through the story are about 8 people who ended up being on US postal stamps. And
Wow.
it's like it's a funny way to talk about it, but these are people who were in no way sort of big fish in small ponds. These are people who really influenced and shaped the course of American history in the 20th century. And
No, it's icons that end up on postage stamps.
right, and the fact that they happen to cross paths in Washington at the end of the Wilsonian era is in and of itself an interesting phenomenon.
Of the works themselves, what were the plays that had the most impact and that were best received and maybe even had crossover appeal?
Well, there wasn't in the end a lot of crossover, but there was a very interesting, another figure in the book, Willis Richardson, who became the first African-American playwright to have a play produced on Broadway. And he also had a play produced in Budapest in 1931. And he becomes a bit of an obscure figure because he's writing he wrote 2 kinds of plays. One were kind of historical plays to be performed in schools. So he wrote a couple of dozen of those, and they were published by Du Bois and others, but they had a very specific pedagogical purpose. But the others were domestic dramas about African-American life. African-American middle-class life, and the day in and day out struggles of people. Some of them are a bit too structured and didactic to carry much weight today. There's one where there are 2 brothers. One becomes a chemical researcher, the other becomes a kind of real estate scam artist. And in the end, it's the chemist brother who actually achieves the most. But the point is that these were storylines about an African-American society that whites very rarely had access to. He he worked for the U.S. Bureau of Engraving and Printing for 30 or 40 years. And when he retired, he tried to promote his plays, but by the 70s, they were already a bit old-fashioned. Although a couple of his plays have been produced recently. But he's another one of these figures who very much is part of the piece, which is if Wilson is going to endorse a corrupt mistelling of our story, as in Griffith's The Birth of a Nation, we're going to tell people what we think the story is. And hopefully out of that we'll win respect.
How did the protagonists attempt the balance between outright political messaging or propaganda versus creating art? And is that even necessary? I mean, in some ways, I often think of storytelling as a Trojan horse when it comes to delivering messages, in that if you make a political argument, what you generally get in response is a counter argument. But when you tell a story, you get a very different engagement.
Well, this was a division which emerged directly in debates about how to respond to The Birth of a Nation. And there are a group of people, I write about them, and the simple storyline that gets passed down is a division between theater as propaganda and theater as folk expression, as personified maybe by W.E.B. Du Bois and Alain Locke. In fact, the lines are much blurrier than that, but that's the way the story is told. And that's a division that runs through African-American theatrical life today, because there's a desire to not just tell our story, but respond to hostility, and to use theater and film and the arts as a way of mobilizing people rather than just exploring. And so that division is there. The protagonists very much felt it. These were polemical debates that were carried out in journals and in meetings and in what got put on stage and in criticism. But in fact, both sides of this story they really have a common objective, which is to establish full citizenship for African American communities. They just try to get them in different ways.
Is there a collective legacy for the story? I mean, what starts as essentially a drama club and becomes so much more. When you look at the story in total and all the great characters that you tell the tales of, many of whom, as you said, 8 on postage stamps, is there a collective legacy of this tale of the Washington stage?
I think there is a collective legacy. The story, for a variety of reasons, moves to New York. And there's a flowering of African-American theater in New York in the 40s and the 50s. The nature of Black theater changes after Baraka's The Dutchman in 1960. There's what some would say is a radicalization of the stage. But you also have, well, not directly connected to the story, but really part of a larger trend line. You end up in the end of the 20th century with August Wilson's masterful Pittsburgh cycle of 10 great plays. This is part of that larger trajectory. It is obviously there are a lot of other forces involved, and the main action in some ways moves away from Washington, but Washington is still an important player in all of this. The number of people who went through Howard University who ended up shaping the American theatrical landscape it's a very rich legacy. So yes, I mean there's the story of this particular group of people, and obviously by the mid-20s, Gregory's gone. Locke begins a new part of the story, and other developments happen. But this is sort of the origin story of a lot of trends that play out.
I want to ask you about 2 turns of a phrase. One in the title, Portraying the Soul of a People. Is this simply poetry in titling, or does this describe something that theater is actually capable of?
Well, this was Willis Richardson's mantra, and he wanted to produce a theater that reflected the soul of a people, the soul of his people, because he felt his people had a soul that was worth recognizing. So this is a turn of phrase that comes directly from Richardson and his work. And I think that that's an important part of it. When you get to, even now, but particularly the debates about Wilson's work, why is it important for Wilson's work to have been presented by African-American actors and tell African-American stories? There was criticism of Wilson that he wasn't being universal enough. But if you go back to Richardson, I think you see that there's a powerful need to actually tell, as Gregory said about Irish National Theater, tell our story, which is a valid story, unmediated by the pens of others.
Yeah. Another phrase, and I want to ask you, in your acknowledgments, you begin with the statement, "The creation of beauty in the face of malice is a radical act." That your words, or is that a quote?
Those are my words.
That's a beautiful turn of phrase.
I firmly believe that, and of course there are people who don't believe that. But I just, this comes out of my Soviet studies background. Mm-hmm. The effort to use personal expression to add what one considers beauty in the world flies in the face of authorities who want to deny somebody's humanity. And I think this is a very powerful strain in Soviet literature and Russian literature. And it's a gift from that part of my life that I've carried with me forward. And it's for me a very important insight on the human condition.
Well, if Portraying the Soul of a People, it describes the book, I think that phrase, "The creation of beauty in the face of malice is a radical act," certainly reveals something about the soul of the author. Blair, thank you for joining us today. Congratulations on the book. And here's the good news to those of you watching and listening. You can read the book absolutely free on the Wilson Center's website if you visit wilsoncenter.org. Blair, congratulations. Thanks again.
Thank you very much, John. It's always a pleasure to.
The book is Portraying the Soul of a People, African Americans Confront Wilson's Legacy from the Washington Stage. And that's all for this edition of Wilson Center Now. So until the next time, we hope you will return. I'm John Molesky. Thanks for being here.